The winter of 1887 stands as perhaps the most unforgiving in the recorded history of the Montana Territory. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero for weeks on end. Snow accumulated to depths that swallowed cabins whole, and supply trains ceased their passage through mountain passes until the late days of April. Yet, in a small mining camp nestled in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, not a single soul succumbed to starvation. This fact alone would be unremarkable if not for one curious detail found in the camp ledger. The food stores had been calculated to last only until mid-February, a full 2 months before supplies could possibly arrive. For over a century, historians attributed this survival to fortunate weather breaks or exaggerated record-keeping. The truth, however, was buried in a weathered journal discovered during the restoration of the old Sweetgrass County Courthouse in 1964, a discovery that would reveal how the innovative foresight of one ridiculed mountain man saved dozens of lives through what locals initially dismissed as primitive foolishness. Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of locals' history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The small mining settlement of Granite Creek had emerged like many others across the Montana Territory, hastily assembled where precious metals had been discovered, populated by a mixture of hardened prospectors, failed farmers from the east, and various tradesmen seeking fortune in the new frontier. By 1887, the camp had grown to nearly 60 permanent residents, with wooden structures replacing the original tents and a rudimentary main street forming what locals optimistically called downtown. The settlement's position had been chosen for proximity to the gold-bearing quartz veins, rather than for any considerations of winter habitability. Nestled in a narrow valley at 7,800 feet elevation, Granite Creek sat in the path of northern winds that funneled between higher peaks, creating conditions that even seasoned mountain men described as unnaturally bitter. The surrounding forest provided ample timber for construction and fuel, while a small but reliable creek offered water. Even in the coldest months, provided one was willing to break through ice that could reach 3 feet in thickness. Thomas Wheeler, the camp's self-appointed record keeper and owner of the general store, maintained meticulous accounts of supplies, weather patterns, and significant events. His entries from the summer of 1887 paint a picture of routine frontier existence, shipments arriving by wagon every 3 weeks, minor disputes over claim boundaries, preparation for what most expected to be a typical Montana winter. The prevailing attitude was one of experienced confidence. Most residents had weathered at least 2 winters in the territory and considered themselves veterans of frontier hardship. Wheeler's store stood at the center of camp life, a 2-story wooden structure with living quarters above and commercial space below. His ledger entry from July 3, 1887, notes the arrival of 6 wagons carrying supplies ordered months earlier. Received full complement of provisions including Powell's 200 pounds of flour, 600 pounds of sugar, 400 pounds of coffee, and sundry dried goods. Winter stock now at 70% of projected requirement. Expect remaining items by September transport. The methodical inventory reflects Wheeler's background as a former quartermaster's assistant during the Civil War, a position that had instilled in him an appreciation for organization, if not necessarily for redundant planning. Among these settlers was Jeremiah Collins, a solitary figure who had arrived in the camp during its earliest days, yet remained something of an outsider. Collins had trapped and traded throughout the Rockies for nearly 20 years before gold fever swept the territory. His cabin stood apart from the others, positioned higher on the ridge where the forest met the alpine meadow. While most men devoted themselves entirely to mining operations, Collins divided his time between his modest claim and what he termed insurance work, activities that drew bemused mockery from his neighbors. At 53 years of age, Collins carried himself with the economy of movement common to men who have survived decades in unforgiving environments. His weathered face rarely revealed emotion, though those who engaged him directly found him willing to share knowledge, if not personal history. What little was known about his background came from fragmented stories shared during rare appearances at communal gatherings, years spent with Shoshone hunters in his youth, a period trading with Hudson's Bay Company outposts, some experience as a guide for early geological surveys. Whether these accounts were entirely factual remained a subject of speculation, but his practical knowledge of mountain conditions was evident to any who observed his preparations. Wheeler's ledger entry from August 12, 1887 notes, Collins again requesting permission to construct what he terms a mountain fence on the western ridge. Committee denied as before, citing waste of valuable time better spent on claim development and winter preparations. Collins warned that persistence on this matter may result in camp sanction. The Camp Committee, a self-appointed governance body consisting of the 5 largest claim holders, operated with the pragmatic authority common to frontier settlements. Without formal legal standing, their decisions carried weight through economic leverage and social pressure, rather than enforceable statute. Their rejection of Collins's proposal reflected not legal authority over the public land in question, but rather their influence over community resources and labor allocation. The implied threat of camp sanction, a flexible concept that might include exclusion from communal activities, restricted access to the trading post, or simple ostracism, carried significant weight in a remote settlement where isolation could equal death. What precisely this mountain fence entailed becomes clear only through cross-referencing with Collins's personal journal, discovered nearly 8 decades later. The weathered pages reveal detailed schematics for an elaborate system of interconnected cedar post fences, strategically positioned to create natural snow collection points that would funnel and trap game animals seeking passage through the high mountain corridor during winter months. The design relies on natural movement patterns observed over 15 seasons, Collins wrote. Snow accumulation between the fence rows creates passages that concentrate game travel. When food grows scarce in the upper elevations, elk and deer will follow these passages directly into the collection yard. One properly maintained fence system can supply meat for 30 men through 4 months of deep winter without a single bullet fired. The journal contains meticulous observations of animal migration patterns, snow accumulation rates at different elevations, and wind dynamics across the western ridge. Collins had mapped prevailing storm directions, identified natural depressions where drifts would form regardless of fence placement, and calculated optimal angles for fence sections to maximize both snow accumulation and game funneling. The level of detail reflects not merely practical experience, but a systematic approach to environmental observation that bridged indigenous knowledge systems and scientific methodology. One page contains a cross-sectional drawing of fence post placement with precise measurements. Posts set 30 inches deep minimum, 16 to 20 feet apart, depending on grade. South-facing sections require 12-inch additional depth to accommodate freeze-thaw cycle. All posts notched at 34 inches for lower rail, 52 inches for upper rail. Rails secured with rawhide binding, not nails, to allow expansion movement during temperature extremes. The Camp Committee's rejection reflected the broader sentiment that Collins's traditional trapping methods were outdated relics in the modern era of mining and commerce. Wheeler recorded several instances where Collins became the subject of ridicule during camp gatherings, with one entry noting, "Much laughter tonight at Barlow's expense account of Collins's primitive fence foolishness." Collins departed early amid suggestions he return to the Shoshone if he prefers Indian ways to progress. This dismissal of indigenous and traditional knowledge was common throughout frontier development, reflecting both the practical emphasis on immediate economic returns and deeper cultural biases For men whose identity and status were tied to notions of technological progress and conquest of wilderness, Collins' approach represented an uncomfortable alternative narrative, one that suggested human survival in extreme environments might depend more on adaptation to natural patterns than domination of them. Samuel Barlow, whose mockery Wheeler recorded, exemplified this perspective. A relatively recent arrival to Montana, Barlow had made his initial fortune selling steam-powered equipment to mining operations throughout Colorado and Nevada. His own claim at Granite Creek utilized mechanized extraction methods that, while impressive in favorable conditions, would prove vulnerable to the extended cold that lay ahead. His September 5th letter to a business associate in Helena, preserved in state archives, reveals the prevailing attitude. The old-timers and Indian lovers with their superstitions about this winter will bankrupt themselves with excessive preparations, while the rest of us extract maximum profit. When spring arrives, we shall see whose approach history favors. Despite these rejections, Collins proceeded with his plans independently, working alone on weekends when others rested or socialized. By late September, he had constructed approximately half of his envisioned system on public land beyond the boundary of mining claims. The effort required hauling hundreds of cedar posts up steep terrain and setting them deep enough to withstand mountain winds. According to his journal, Collins completed this work by mid-October, just as the first snowfall dusted the highest elevations. The physical labor involved was substantial. Collins's journal records that each cedar post weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, with the larger anchor posts reaching nearly 100 pounds. Each had to be carried up slopes too steep and rocky for draft animals. His entry from September 18th notes, "Completed western section today, 16 posts set. Back pain significant but manageable with willow bark tea. Will rest tomorrow and continue Tuesday if weather permits. Estimate 26 more days of work if I maintain current pace." The journal also reveals that Collins was not working entirely from memory or prior examples. Several pages contain modifications to the basic design, with notes regarding adjustments made for the specific topography and game populations of the Absaroka region. One entry observes, "Mule deer in this range follow different patterns than northern populations. Fence angle at southwest corner adjusted to accommodate observed travel routes. Collection yard expanded by 12 feet to prevent overcrowding and trampling during heavy snowfall events." Wheeler's entry from October 23rd reveals the camp's continued dismissal. Collins reports completion of his fence contraption on the western ridge, invited camp members to inspect before heavy snow. No interest expressed. Winter supply calculations complete. Adequate provisions secured through February, with expected train resumption by late March. Standard winter buffer of 4 weeks deemed sufficient by committee vote. The methodical preparation of the camp followed conventional wisdom. The root cellar beneath Wheeler's store contained preserved vegetables, flour, coffee, and other staples calculated to last through the expected supply interruption. Salted meat was stored in appropriate quantities, and each household maintained their personal reserves. By all standard measures, the camp was well prepared for a normal Montana winter. Wheeler's inventory, recorded with characteristic precision, listed provisions including 1,840 pounds of flour, 920 pounds of salt pork, 460 pounds of coffee, 560 pounds of sugar, 230 pounds of dried beans, 180 pounds of dried fruit, and various other staples. Distributed among the camp's 60 residents, these supplies would provide approximately 1,600 calories per person per day through February, adequate for survival, though not for comfort, especially given the caloric demands of staying warm in sub-zero temperatures. Each household had also been encouraged to maintain private stores, though the extent of these varied widely based on means and inclination. The committee had mandated minimum requirements, at least 60 days' worth of basic provisions for each household, but enforcement was limited to social pressure rather than inspection. Committee members led by example, with Barlow making a show of purchasing double the recommended quantities from Wheeler's store in early October. November arrived with moderate snowfall and temperatures that allowed for continued mining operations. The mood in the camp remained optimistic, with Wheeler recording several successful gold extractions and plans for Christmas celebrations. Collins's activities during this period receive only passing mention, with one cryptic entry noting, "Collins appears to be constructing some manner of storage shed behind his cabin. Claims it for winter preservation needs. Man grows more peculiar by the month." The camp's social dynamics during this period followed seasonal patterns familiar to frontier mining settlements. As outdoor work became increasingly difficult, communal activities increased. Wheeler's ledger records evening gatherings in the larger cabins, rotating between households with sufficient space. A small library of shared books circulated through the community, and an informal musical group met twice weekly with instruments that included 2 fiddles, a concertina, and a mandolin. These activities served not merely as entertainment, but as critical bonds that would help maintain community cohesion during the isolation ahead. What Wheeler could not have known was that Collins was preparing specialized smoking chambers and drying racks based on techniques he had learned from Shoshone hunters years earlier. His journal details the construction of 3 connected chambers with precise ventilation channels designed to cure large quantities of meat quickly while minimizing fuel consumption, a critical factor during deep winter when gathering wood became increasingly difficult. "Smoking chamber completed today," Collins wrote on November 16th. 3 compartments with graduated heat flow, central fire chamber lined with river stones for heat retention, ventilation channels positioned to maximize smoke contact while minimizing direct heat. Design allows processing of approximately 200 pounds of meat simultaneously while consuming less than 1/4 cord of wood per cycle. The journal includes detailed drawings of the smoking chamber's construction with particular attention to the ventilation system that allowed precise control of temperature and smoke density. Collins had integrated elements from various traditional designs he had encountered. The stone heat sink common to Shoshone smoking techniques, ventilation control methods he had observed among northern trappers, and preservation preparations that reflected influences from multiple indigenous traditions. Accompanying these technical specifications are notes on preservation methods adapted for different game animals and cuts. Elk backstrap requires minimum 3-day salt cure before smoking. Venison hindquarters benefit from 24-hour juniper berry soak to offset winter diet bitterness. Fat must be rendered separately and stored in clay pots, not leather, to prevent rancidity in temperature fluctuations. The first significant storm arrived on December 7th, dropping 3 feet of snow in 36 hours and sending temperatures plummeting. Wheeler's entry simply states, "Winter properly arrived, mining operations suspended. Camp settling in for the season." What follows in the ledger are routine accounts of community activities, card games, minor ailments treated by the camp's amateur physician, and weekly inventory checks of the communal supplies. The storm marked the transition to winter routine for most camp residents. Mining operations became impossible as shafts filled with snow or froze solid. Attention turned to maintenance of living spaces, clearing snow from roofs, managing fuel consumption, and establishing packed trails between buildings. Wheeler's ledger notes the formation of work parties for communal labor, roof clearing rotation established, 6 men per team, each cabin cleared every 3rd day. Fuel gathering parties depart daily at first light, return by noon. Afternoon reserved for individual needs and maintenance. For most residents, the early winter weeks passed without undue hardship. Temperatures remained within expected ranges, between 10 above and 20 below 0 Fahrenheit. The snow accumulation, while substantial, followed familiar patterns that the experienced residents had anticipated. The communal supplies remained secure in the root cellar beneath Wheeler's store, and the weekly inventory showed consumption rates matching projections. The general mood, as recorded in Wheeler's ledger and later recollections collected by historians, was one of routine adjustment to winter conditions. Collins' name vanishes from Wheeler's records during this period, suggesting the solitary man kept to himself, as was his custom, during winter months. His own journal, however, reveals his daily observations of the snowpack, wind patterns, and, most importantly, the functioning of his fence system. By mid-December, Collins recorded the first success: fence working precisely as designed. First collection yielded 2 elk bulls, meat processed according to method. Estimated yield 340 pounds preserved. The journal details the process with characteristic precision. First animal processed within 3 hours of collection. Quarters hung in outer chamber for initial cooling. Temperature maintained between 28-32 degrees. Blood drained and preserved separately in birch containers with pine ash mixture. Hide scraped and stretched on a north wall frame. Began smoking process at dusk. Maintained low temperature through night with hourly monitoring. Subsequent entries track the smoking duration, weight loss during preservation, and storage organization. Collins had constructed specialized racks within his cabin's root cellar, arranged to allow air circulation while maintaining consistent temperature. His notes reveal attention to every aspect of the preservation process. Finished meat, wrapped in cleaned intestinal lining, then canvas, then stored in graduated temperature zones based on intended storage duration. Anticipate minimum 90-day viability for portions in coldest section. The true test of both the camp's conventional preparations and Collins' alternative approach began in early January. Wheeler's January 8th entry reads, "Thermometer recorded 28 degrees below zero at noon. No warming expected. Tunnel access to outlying cabins now necessary as snow depth exceeds 9 feet in open areas. Communal meal schedule implemented to conserve fuel and provisions." This entry marks a significant shift in the camp's operations. The communal meal schedule referenced was a contingency plan that consolidated food preparation to conserve both provisions and fuel. Rather than each household maintaining separate cooking fires throughout the day, meals were prepared in rotation between the larger cabins with more efficient stoves. This measure reflected growing concern about the duration of the winter isolation and the adequacy of supplies if conditions worsened. The temperature Wheeler recorded, 28 below at midday, exceeded typical winter lows for the region, but more concerning was the duration of the cold. Historical weather records from nearby settlements confirm that the cold snap that began in early January 1887 continued without significant moderation for nearly 6 weeks, an unprecedented duration that strained both human endurance and material preparations. The snow accumulation presented equally serious challenges. Wheeler's reference to 9-foot depths was not hyperbole. Archaeological excavations conducted at similar elevation mining camps have confirmed that snow accumulation during the winter of 1887-88 reached extraordinary levels throughout the northern Rockies. The tunnel access, Wheeler mentions, became a defining feature of that winter, with residents digging corridors through snowpack to maintain connections between buildings as surface travel became impossible. What Wheeler did not record, but later witnesses would confirm, was the increasingly serious calculations being made regarding food supplies. The winter had arrived earlier and with greater ferocity than any in living memory. The coldest temperatures, normally reserved for brief January periods, extended week after week, and snowfall continued at unprecedented rates. By January 20th, even with rationing, the camp's supplies were being consumed at nearly twice the projected rate. This accelerated consumption stemmed from several factors. The extreme cold increased caloric requirements significantly, the human body burning additional calories simply to maintain core temperature. The physical labor of snow clearing, tunnel maintenance, and wood gathering in such conditions further increased nutritional needs. Additionally, the communal meal system, while more fuel efficient, proved less effective at stretching food supplies than individual household rationing had been. Wheeler's private notes, separate from the official ledger and discovered among family papers decades later, reveal growing anxiety. Inventory today confirms troubling trajectory. Flour reserves at 640 pounds, depleting at approximately 18 pounds daily. Salt pork nearly half consumed. Coffee and sugar will be exhausted by early February if current consumption continues. Must consider further rationing measures, though effects on morale concerning. A pivotal moment came on February 2nd, when Wheeler convened an emergency committee meeting. His ledger entry is uncharacteristically emotional. Situation growing dire. At current consumption, communal supplies exhausted by February 25th. No prospect of supply train before April at earliest. Committee considering reduction to half rations effective immediately. Hunting parties attempted but returned empty-handed due to extreme conditions and scarcity of game in accessible areas. The hunting expeditions Wheeler references had been increasingly desperate attempts to supplement dwindling supplies. 3 separate parties had ventured into the surrounding forest despite dangerous conditions, but deep snow and extreme cold had driven game animals to inaccessible areas or reduced their movement to the point where tracking became impossible. One party had spent 3 full days in the field and returned with only a single snowshoe hare, hardly worth the calories expended in the effort. The committee meeting lasted into the night, with heated debate about resource allocation and emergency measures. Proposals included further reductions in rations, more aggressive attempts at hunting regardless of risk, and consideration of dispatching messengers to seek help from nearest settlements, a virtual suicide mission given the conditions. The tension had begun to strain community cohesion, with accusations of hoarding and demands for inspection of private reserves. It was at this meeting that someone remembered Collins and his primitive fence system. Initially suggested in jest, the idea of checking whether the solitary trapper had succeeded where conventional hunting failed quickly gained serious consideration. The next day, a 3-man delegation trudged through snow tunnels to Collins's cabin, expecting to find him in similarly dire straits. The delegation consisted of Wheeler himself, representing the committee's authority, Dr. James Harrington, the camp's amateur physician who had received some formal medical training before abandoning a Philadelphia practice for gold prospects, and Samuel Barlow, whose earlier mockery of Collins's methods now gave way to pragmatic desperation. They departed at first light, following the precarious tunnel system to the camp perimeter, then breaking trail through chest-deep snow for the quarter-mile to Collins' isolated cabin. Wheeler's ledger entry from February 3rd records their journey with uncharacteristic brevity. Delegation departed 7:15 a.m. for Collins' cabin. Returned 1:40 p.m. results favorable beyond expectation. Committee reconvening immediately to discuss implications. The emotional restraint of this entry belies the astonishment the delegation experienced, detailed more fully in Dr. Harrington's personal correspondence discovered among family papers in 1983. What they discovered instead would fundamentally change the camp's understanding of frontier preparation. Collins's smokehouse contained over 600 pounds of preserved elk, deer, and mountain goat meat, processed using methods that maintained both nutrition and flavor. His journal entry from that day notes with characteristic understatement. Camp delegation arrived, expressed interest in fence results, have agreed to share preserved meat on condition that additional men assist with maintenance and processing. System functioning exactly as designed. Latest collection yesterday yielded 1 bull elk and 2 does. Dr. Harrington's letter to his brother, written later that spring but never mailed, found unsealed among his effects, provides a more emotional account. I shall never forget the moment Collins opened his storehouse door. Before us hung row upon row of perfectly preserved game meat, sufficient to feed the entire camp for months. The man whom Barlow had mocked as a primitive fool stood now as our salvation. The look that passed between them contained volumes on the folly of arrogance. Wheeler's corresponding entry reveals the committee's astonishment. Collins's fence contraption apparently successful beyond all reasonable expectation. Storage facilities contain sufficient meat to supplement camp rations through April if properly managed. Collins amenable to sharing but insists on controlling distribution to prevent waste. Committee has agreed to his terms out of necessity. Pride must yield to survival. The arrangement that followed required significant adjustment to the camp's social hierarchy. Collins, previously marginalized, now controlled the most valuable resource in the settlement. To his credit, historical records indicate he neither gloated nor exploited this reversal of fortune. His journal details a carefully calculated distribution system that ensured fair sharing while maintaining necessary reserves. He also insisted on training several younger men in the maintenance of the fence system and proper preservation techniques. Collins's journal entry from February 4th outlines his conditions. Agreement reached with camp committee. Will provide meat sufficient for 1 pound per person daily. In exchange, camp to provide 4 men daily for fence maintenance and processing work. Wheeler to adjust existing ration system to accommodate meat distribution. All preservation to follow my methods precisely to prevent spoilage. The specific requirements Collins imposed were not arbitrary but reflected his understanding of the critical nature of proper preservation. His journal details instructions provided to the work crews. Team must maintain strict hygiene protocols. Hands washed in pine ash mixture before handling meat. Smoking temperatures must remain between narrow ranges. Too cold and preservation fails. Too hot and meat dries excessively, losing nutritional value. Have selected Harrison, Morgan, Paulson, and the Russian for initial training. Most show appropriate respect for process importance. Wheeler's entries throughout February and March document the evolving attitudes toward Collins and his methods. Initially referred to as Collins' Charity, the shared meat soon became recognized as the camp's salvation. By late February, when the original supplies were indeed exhausted, the supplemental protein from Collins's system provided the difference between severe hardship and outright starvation. The meat distribution followed a carefully structured system recorded in both Wheeler's ledger and Collins's journal. Each household received an allocation based on number of occupants, distributed 3 times weekly to prevent improper storage issues. Families were instructed in proper preparation methods to maximize nutritional value, with Collins providing specific cooking instructions for different cuts and preservation styles. These instructions, initially received with some resistance, were gradually recognized as essential knowledge rather than unnecessary impositions. On February 26th, Wheeler wrote, "Temperature reached 42 below zero last night. Johnson family's cabin roof collapsed under snow weight. All members safely relocated to Community Hall. Remaining flour reserved for ill members. Collins's system collected 3 deer yesterday, meat being processed according to his methods. Committee now recognizing we would be in dire circumstances without this resource previously dismissed as primitive foolishness. The roof collapse." Wheeler mentions reflected another dimension of the winter crisis. The unprecedented snow accumulation had begun to threaten structures throughout the camp, particularly those built hastily with inadequate roof pitches. Collins' cabin, with its steeply angled roof designed specifically for heavy snow loads, remained secure while newer structures began failing under the weight. This architectural validation further reinforced the value of his traditional knowledge, though Wheeler's ledger does not explicitly draw this connection. The Johnson family's relocation to the community hall marked the beginning of a consolidation process that would continue through the remaining winter weeks. As maintaining multiple structures and heating systems became increasingly difficult, families combined households to conserve resources and improve safety. By mid-March, the original 60 residents occupied just 23 heated structures, with empty cabins either used for storage or abandoned to the elements. As February gave way to March with no break in the weather, the community adapted further. Collins's small smokehouse became a center of activity, with rotating teams learning and applying his preservation techniques. His fence system required regular maintenance to keep passages clear after heavy snowfalls, creating a new daily priority for able-bodied men who might otherwise have remained idle in their cabins. The work rotation for fence maintenance followed a schedule documented in Collins's journal. 4-man teams depart at first light, return by mid-afternoon. Each team assigned specific section, western ridge, northern approach, collection yard, or processing duty. Rotation ensures all men learn complete system operation rather than specialized tasks only. Some showing genuine interest beyond immediate necessity. Young Harrison, particularly attentive to design principles. This William Harrison, mentioned repeatedly in Collins's journal, emerges as something of an apprentice figure during the crisis period. A 22-year-old from Vermont who had arrived in Montana just 18 months earlier, Harrison had initially followed his uncle into mining, but showed greater aptitude for practical skills than prospecting. Collins's entries suggest a developing mentorship. Harrison completed first solo processing today. Work methodical and attentive to detail. Asked intelligent questions about smoke density effects on different meat types. Have provided additional instruction on hide preparation techniques at his request. Perhaps most significantly, the communal meal system evolved to incorporate what Collins called waste reduction practices, methods of utilizing every part of the harvested animals that many of the miners had previously considered unpalatable. Bone broths, organ meat preparations, and preservation of fat for cooking became standard practices under Collins's quiet instruction. These practices represented not merely practical necessity, but a fundamental shift in relationship to resources. Collins' journal articulates this philosophy explicitly. Have explained to work crews that respect for the animal requires complete utilization. This is not merely practical conservation, but ethical obligation. Animals that surrender their lives to the fence system deserve honor through complete use. Some men understand this principle. Others see only utility, but all now follow the practices. The specific techniques Collins taught included methods for extracting bone marrow, preparing organ meats to maximize palatability, and utilizing parts previously discarded such as hooves for gelatin, hides for tools and repairs, and sinew for cordage and binding materials. His journal includes detailed instructions for each process, often noting their origins in indigenous knowledge systems, demonstrated Shoshone method for brain preparation today. Initial resistance overcome when served with juniper berries and wild onion preserved from fall harvest. Wheeler, particularly impressed, requested instruction for his wife in preparation technique. Wheeler's March 15th entry notes. Collins demonstrated preparation of marrow pudding today using previously discarded bones. Reception initially hesitant, but economic necessity overcame objections. Result surprisingly palatable and substantial. Collins claims highest nutritional value of all preparations. The gradual integration of Collins's knowledge extended beyond food preservation to other aspects of winter survival. Wheeler's ledger records instruction sessions on efficient fire maintenance, snow insulation techniques for cabins, and cold weather clothing adaptations. Collins demonstrated methods for treating frostbite using pine resin and moss poultices, techniques for preventing snow blindness, and modifications to standard tools for use in extreme cold. Dr. Cha. Harrington's notes from this period, maintained separately from Wheeler's official record, document the health impacts of Collins's interventions. The introduction of fresh meat, particularly organ portions, has markedly improved conditions among those showing early signs of nutritional deficiency. Mrs. Peterson's gum bleeding has ceased entirely. Collins's insistence on bone broth consumption appears vindicated by observable health improvements throughout the camp. The historical significance of this cultural transmission extends beyond the immediate survival situation. Several of these preparation methods became standard practices in the region for decades thereafter, spreading to other mining camps and eventually into the culinary traditions of early Montana settlements. Food historian Margaret Ellison's 1958 survey of Montana cooking traditions traced specific preservation techniques directly back to this winter and Collins' influence. Ellison's research, based on interviews with descendants of original Granite Creek residents, documented the persistence of specific preparation methods. The distinctive marrow pudding still prepared for special occasions in several Sweetgrass County families derives directly from the Collins tradition, according to multiple independent sources. Similarly, the juniper-cured venison technique, common throughout the eastern foothills, maintains remarkably faithful adherence to the process documented in Collins's journal, indicating successful transmission across at least 3 generations. By late March, when temperatures finally moderated enough to attempt limited travel between settlements, the camp at Granite Creek had established a new normal. Collins's fence system continued to produce, though at reduced rates, as animals began finding forage in lower elevations. The communal meal system remained in place, with preservation techniques being documented by Wheeler with the same meticulous attention previously reserved for mining outputs and supply inventories. Wheeler's March 28th entry provides a quantitative assessment. Fence system has provided approximately 1,680 pounds of processed meat since agreement implementation. Distribution system functioning smoothly under current protocol. Committee agrees to maintain communal approach through April regardless of weather improvement, as efficiency benefits now evident beyond emergency conditions. The transition toward spring brought new challenges and opportunities. As temperatures occasionally rose above freezing during daylight hours, Collins directed attention to collecting early emerging plants with nutritional or medicinal value. His journal details instruction sessions on identifying and properly harvesting pine cambium, early willow buds, and various root vegetables that could supplement the meat-heavy winter diet. First cattail shoots emerging in protected southern marsh, Collins wrote on March 30th, demonstrated proper harvesting technique to preserve root system for continued growth. Nutritional value highest in early growth stage. Team harvested approximately 8 pounds today, sufficient for addition to communal meal, reception positive, particularly among those who recognize value in diet diversification. The first supply train reached Granite Creek on April 11, 1887, breaking the isolation that had lasted over 4 months. Wheeler's entry from that day states simply, "Train arrived 2:17 p.m., all camp members present and in reasonable health. No fatalities from winter circumstances, which Conductor Blackburn states is unique among settlements visited. Attribute this result to Collins' system and cooperative adherence to distribution protocols. The arrival of supplies marked the technical end of the crisis period, but not the conclusion of its impact on camp culture." Wheeler's subsequent entries document continued operation of Collins's fence system alongside resumed mining activities, with designated teams maintaining the trap lines and processing facilities even as others returned to their claims. The communal meal system gradually transitioned back to individual household cooking, but weekly community dinners continued, a social institution that had not existed before the crisis. In the days that followed, as conditions allowed increased movement and communication with other settlements, the true severity of that winter became apparent. Nearby camps had suffered multiple casualties from starvation, exposure, and nutrition-related illnesses. The death toll across the territory reached into the hundreds, with isolated homesteads particularly vulnerable. By any objective measure, the survival of Granite Creek without a single fatality represented an extraordinary outcome. Official territorial records, compiled later that year, documented the differential impact of the winter on various settlements. The report, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, notes, mining camp at Silver Creek reports 7 deceased from starvation and related conditions. Petersburg Homestead Community records 14 deceased. Multiple isolated cabins discovered with all occupants deceased when spring travel resumed. Against this backdrop of regional tragedy, Granite Creek's survival intact represents a remarkable achievement attributable directly to the knowledge system Collins had implemented. The spring and summer of 1887 brought significant changes to the camp's social structure and preparation philosophy. Wheeler's May 6th entry notes, "Committee meeting concluded with unanimous vote to implement Collins' recommendations for next winter's preparations. Construction of communal smokehouse to begin next week. Collins appointed to lead three-man team for fence system expansion. Previous mockery now replaced with deference to his expertise." Collins' elevation to an official leadership position represented a remarkable reversal of status. His journal entries from this period show an expanded scope of activity, with responsibilities extending beyond his personal preparations to community-wide planning. He supervised the construction of an enlarged smokehouse near the center of the settlement, designed with capacity to process and store meat for the entire camp population. He directed improvements to existing structures to better withstand snow loads, and he established formal training sessions in various preservation techniques. The lessons of necessity became institutional knowledge. Collins's detailed diagram of his fence system was copied into the official camp record book alongside Wheeler's supply calculations. The committee established new protocols requiring multiple redundant food storage methods and expanded the emergency buffer from 4 weeks to 8. Most tellingly, Wheeler's inventory system now included categories previously absent: traditional preservation capacity and non-conventional food sources. This formal incorporation of Collins's knowledge system represented more than practical adaptation. It signified a fundamental shift in how the community valued different forms of expertise. Wheeler's private correspondence from June 1887 acknowledges this transformation explicitly. "We have been humbled by circumstances into recognizing wisdom where we previously saw only backwardness. Collins' methods, derived from sources we had dismissed as primitive, proved more adaptive to extreme conditions than our modern confidence." There is a lesson here that extends beyond winter preparations. Collins himself, according to personal accounts collected by local historian James Whitfield in the 1940s, accepted this elevation in status with characteristic reserve. He trained willing students in his techniques, participated more actively in community planning, but maintained his separate cabin and independent habits. His journal entries from this period show satisfaction not in personal recognition, but in the transmission of knowledge he considered essential for frontier survival. On June 17, 1887, he wrote, "Young Harrison shows particular aptitude for understanding game movement patterns, has suggested logical extension of south fence section that improves efficiency. Proper respect for animal resources and waste prevention remains challenging concept for many, but necessity has created willing students where preference would not." The relationship between Collins and Harrison developed into a formal apprenticeship during the summer months. Collins's journal details instructional activities ranging from practical skills to philosophical discussions. Spent afternoon teaching Harrison proper cedar selection for fence posts. Demonstrated how to identify trees with appropriate heartwood density and straight grain. Explained relationship between harvest timing and moon phase, affecting sap content and preservation quality. Boy asks thoughtful questions about why rather than merely how, indicating potential for true understanding rather than mere technique replication. This mentorship represents a critical mechanism for knowledge transmission across generations, a pattern that would later prove essential for preserving Collins's methods beyond his personal presence. Harrison would eventually establish his own homestead approximately 15 miles from Granite Creek, where he implemented modified versions of Collins's techniques adapted to his specific location. His descendants maintained these practices well into the 20th century, providing an important source of continuity for later historical documentation. The Great Winter of 1887-88, as it came to be known, gradually transformed from immediate experience to historical reference point. The events at Granite Creek became part of regional lore, though often with embellishments and simplifications that obscured the more nuanced lessons. Collins himself remained at the camp until 1893, when declining gold yields prompted many residents to seek opportunities elsewhere. His subsequent activities are poorly documented, with some accounts placing him further north in the Canadian Rockies, others suggesting he returned to the Bitterroot Valley, where he had first learned trapping decades earlier. Wheeler maintained his meticulous records until the camp's official dissolution in 1896, by which time most structures had been abandoned or disassembled for materials. His ledgers and personal papers were transferred to the Sweetgrass County Courthouse, where they remained largely unexamined in storage until the building renovation of 1964. It was during this renovation that Collins's personal journal was discovered, having been apparently gifted to Wheeler before Collins's departure and subsequently filed away with administrative documents. The courthouse renovation that uncovered these documents might easily have resulted in their destruction rather than preservation. According to county records, the renovation plan included disposal of non-essential historical materials to create additional storage space for current legal documents. The preservation of Wheeler's ledgers and Collins's journal is attributed to County Clerk Margaret Wilson, who recognized potential historical value in the weathered books and set them aside for further examination rather than disposal. Wilson's decision to preserve these materials exemplifies the often fragile nature of historical documentation, particularly for marginalized perspectives. In her brief note accompanying the materials when transferring them to the Montana Historical Society, she wrote, "These journals appear to contain detailed accounts of survival methods during the severe winter of 1887-88, including techniques adapted from Native American practices. While not legally relevant to current county operations, they may hold significant cultural and historical value." The convergence of these two primary sources, Wheeler's official records and Collins's private journals, provides an unusually complete picture of how traditional knowledge, initially dismissed as outdated and primitive, ultimately proved essential for community survival. The story offers a compelling counterpoint to the common frontier narrative that emphasizes technological progress and dismisses indigenous and traditional practices as relics of a bygone era. Particularly significant is the detailed documentation of knowledge transfer between cultural traditions. Collins's journal explicitly acknowledges the indigenous origins of many techniques he employed, often naming specific individuals who had shared knowledge with him during his earlier years living among Shoshone communities. One entry from 1874, predating the Granite Creek period, records, "Old Buffalo Horn demonstrated smoke preservation method today, using green pine boughs for flavor enhancement. Technique creates distinctive taste while extending preservation period by approximately 20 days. Have practiced under his supervision with successful results." These acknowledgments of indigenous sources contrast sharply with the more common pattern of appropriation without attribution that characterized much frontier adaptation of Native American techniques. Collins's careful documentation provides rare insight into specific pathways of cross-cultural knowledge transmission, challenging simplistic narratives of independent discovery by white settlers. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Collins's fence system is not the physical technique itself, which required specific terrain and conditions to function effectively, but rather the philosophical approach it embodied. Collins's journal reveals a man who observed natural patterns systematically over many seasons, who designed systems to work with rather than against these patterns, and who planned for worst-case scenarios while others optimized for the most likely outcomes. This philosophy manifested in multiple aspects of Collins's approach beyond the fence system itself. His cabin design incorporated features specifically adapted to extreme conditions, a steeper roof pitch than was common in the settlement, allowing snow to slide off rather than accumulate, a double-wall construction method that created insulating air spaces, and a specialized chimney design that maximized heat retention while minimizing fuel consumption. His food preservation techniques emphasized nutritional retention over mere prevention of spoilage, reflecting an understanding of dietary needs during physiological stress that anticipated scientific nutritional findings by decades. The committee's initial rejection of Collins's proposal reflects a broader pattern in frontier development, the privileging of new, progressive approaches over traditional knowledge systems, often at great cost. What makes the Granite Creek story remarkable is not just that Collins' alternative approach proved successful, but that the community demonstrated the flexibility to recognize and adopt it despite entrenched biases. Historian Robert Patterson, writing in the Montana Historical Society Quarterly in 1972, observed, "The Granite Creek incident represents a rare documented case where frontier pragmatism ultimately overcame the powerful cultural momentum toward modernization at any cost." Collins' techniques were fundamentally conservative, preserving knowledge developed over generations of mountain living, yet in the context of crisis, they represented the most radical and effective innovation available. Patterson's analysis identifies a key paradox in the Granite Creek experience. The most innovative solution to their crisis came not from novel technology, but from traditional knowledge previously dismissed as outdated. This pattern challenges conventional narratives of progress that assume newer approaches necessarily represent improvement over traditional methods, particularly in contexts where environmental extremes exceed the parameters for which modern systems were designed. The physical evidence of Collins's fence system disappeared within decades as the abandoned mining camp returned to forest and meadow. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1970s identified some post-hole patterns consistent with the diagrams in Collins's journal, but erosion and forest growth had eliminated most traceable evidence. The knowledge system behind the physical structure, however, persisted in modified forms. Several ranching families in the region maintained variations of Collins' game management approaches well into the 20th century. The Harris Ranch, established in 1902 about 20 miles from the original Granite Creek site, incorporated fence techniques explicitly credited to Old Man Collins' winter trap system to manage elk movement patterns around hay storage areas. These modifications helped reduce winter feed loss while maintaining healthy wildlife populations, a balanced approach that embodied Collins's respect for natural systems. The Harris Ranch adaptations represent an important example of knowledge evolution rather than mere preservation. The techniques were modified to serve different purposes, managing wildlife interactions with agricultural operations rather than subsistence hunting, while maintaining the core principles of working with natural movement patterns rather than against them. This adaptive quality helped ensure the knowledge survived changing economic and social contexts rather than being abandoned as irrelevant to new conditions. The nutritional preservation techniques that Collins taught out of necessity during that desperate winter found their way into regional foodways. Particular methods of smoking and drying game meat became distinctive elements of Montana cuisine, with recipes and techniques passed down through generations. A 1934 WPA documentation project on regional food traditions recorded several processes directly traceable to Collins's methods, though by then they were simply considered the mountain way of preservation. Specific techniques documented in the WPA survey include a distinctive juniper berry curing process for venison that Collins's journal attributes to Shoshone influences, a bone marrow extraction method that maximized nutritional value while minimizing waste, and specialized smoking techniques using particular wood combinations to achieve both preservation and flavor enhancement. These methods had been integrated into regional cultural identity, with practitioners often unaware of their specific historical origins in the crisis of 1887-88. As transportation infrastructure improved and food systems became increasingly nationalized throughout the 20th century, the practical necessity of such intensive local food preservation diminished. The knowledge became cultural rather than survival-oriented, preserved in family traditions and local identity rather than daily practice. Yet each time regional transportation systems failed during modern winter emergencies, these older preservation and storage methods regain temporary relevance, serving as a backup system when modern supply chains prove vulnerable. The resilience value of maintaining such traditional knowledge becomes apparent during disruptions to contemporary food systems. During the severe winter storms that isolated parts of Montana in 1978, several remote communities relied on locally preserved food when delivery trucks could not reach them for nearly 3 weeks. Family traditions descended from earlier preservation practices provided critical food security when modern systems failed. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, interest in traditional preservation techniques surged as supply chains faced unprecedented stress, demonstrating the continuing relevance of knowledge systems previously relegated to cultural rather than practical significance. The story of Jeremiah Collins and the winter of 1887 ultimately transcends its specific historical context to illuminate broader patterns of knowledge transmission, adaptation, and resilience. It demonstrates how communities under pressure can overcome prejudice and preconception when survival demands it. It reveals the often hidden value of knowledge systems that optimize for resilience over efficiency, for worst-case scenarios over typical conditions. Contemporary resilience theory, developed largely in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, offers a framework for understanding why Collins' approach proved so effective during crisis conditions. His system emphasized redundancy over efficiency, incorporated diverse food sources rather than relying on single supply mechanisms, and worked with natural patterns rather than attempting to overcome them through technological intervention. These principles align precisely with modern understanding of system resilience, though Collins articulated them through practice rather than theory, drawing on knowledge traditions developed through generations of adaptation to environmental extremes. Perhaps most relevantly for contemporary listeners, it illustrates the danger of dismissing traditional practices as primitive without understanding their underlying logic and purpose. Collins's fence system appeared simplistic to his neighbors because they failed to recognize the sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, snow physics, and preservation chemistry it embodied. Their mockery reflected not superior knowledge, but rather a lack of framework to recognize different forms of expertise. This pattern of dismissal without understanding continues to characterize many interactions between dominant technological paradigms and traditional knowledge systems. Indigenous approaches to environmental management, traditional architectural adaptations to local conditions, and culturally specific health practices often face similar prejudicial rejection before their underlying principles are properly examined. The Granite Creek story provides a compelling historical case study of the potential costs of such dismissal and the benefits of recognizing diverse knowledge traditions. The winter that proved Collins right and saved the camp was not, in historical context, a 1,000-year anomaly. Similar weather patterns had occurred before in the region and would come again. The difference was that Collins's knowledge system included memory of those extremes and preparation for them, while the dominant frontier mentality emphasized optimization for normal conditions and placed excessive faith in technological solutions like supply trains and modern food preservation. Climate historian Susan Johnson, analyzing weather pattern documentation from the Northern Rockies, notes, "The winter of 1887-88 represented an extreme but not unprecedented event, with similar conditions documented in indigenous oral histories and tree ring data from approximately 1785, 1787, and 1823, 1824. What had changed was not the climate pattern, but rather the human memory systems available to the community. As indigenous knowledge keepers who had maintained records of previous extreme events had been largely displaced from the region. This observation highlights another critical aspect of the Collins narrative. His knowledge system incorporated environmental memory extending beyond a single human lifespan, transmitted through cultural practices rather than individual experience. His journal explicitly references information received from older indigenous knowledge keepers about previous extreme winters, allowing him to prepare for conditions beyond his personal experience. This transgenerational knowledge transfer represents a critical resilience mechanism that contemporary systems often lack. In the handwritten addendum to Wheeler's final ledger, dated June 1896, as the camp was being disbanded, he offered a rare personal reflection. As I close these accounts and prepare to depart this place, I find myself contemplating what wisdom we shall carry forward and what shall be abandoned, like these played-out claims. The gold has been extracted and spent. The buildings will soon return to the earth. I consider Collins's quiet lessons the most valuable treasure uncovered in all my years at Granite Creek. When next winter comes, as it always does, I shall be prepared in ways I once thought primitive, but now recognize as essential. Wheeler's words proved prescient. Historical weather records show that the winter of 1898-99 brought similarly extreme conditions to much of the Montana Territory. By then, Wheeler had established a general store in the growing town of Livingston, where he implemented many of the storage and community distribution systems developed during the Granite Creek crisis. Local newspaper accounts credit his preparations with helping the town weather severe supply interruptions with minimal hardship. The Livingston Enterprise of February 8, 1899 reports, Wheeler's Mercantile maintains ample provisions despite 6 weeks without rail service. Community meal service established at Methodist Hall for those with diminishing household supplies. Wheeler's implementation of Collins's approaches in a more established town setting demonstrates how traditional knowledge could be adapted to new contexts rather than being abandoned as irrelevant to progress. The community meal system, preservation techniques, and cooperative resource management established during crisis at Granite Creek became institutionalized as precautionary measures in Wheeler's new community, helping prevent crisis rather than merely responding to it. Proprietor credits mountain methods learned during infamous winter of '87 at Granite Creek, smoking house behind establishment processing game supplied through arrangement with Harris Ranch. Collins himself fades from historical record after his departure from Granite Creek. No death certificate or grave marker has been identified, leaving his ultimate fate to speculation. In some ways, this absence seems fitting for a man who moved quietly through the landscape, observing patterns others missed and preparing for eventualities others dismissed. His most significant legacy was not physical monuments, but transmitted knowledge, fence designs sketched in journals, preservation techniques taught to younger generations, and a philosophy of preparation that valued redundancy and worst-case planning. Oral histories collected from descendants of Granite Creek residents include fragmentary reports of Collins's later years. Several accounts place him near the Canadian border around 1900, still practicing traditional trapping and trading. One second-hand narrative, recorded by the Montana Folklore Society in 1952, suggests he spent his final years teaching traditional skills to younger trappers in the Kootenai region, though documentation remains insufficient for historical confirmation. This uncertainty itself reflects the often precarious nature of historical record-keeping for individuals operating outside mainstream economic and social systems. The journals themselves nearly suffered the fate of most frontier documents, relegated to storage, forgotten, and eventually discarded. Their rediscovery during the 1964 courthouse renovation occurred only because a historically minded clerk recognized potential value in the weathered books and set them aside rather than adding them to the disposal pile. The subsequent authentication and analysis by Montana Historical Society experts revealed their significance, leading to preservation and eventual publication of edited excerpts in 1968. The publication process itself involved significant historical recovery work. The journals had suffered water damage during decades in courthouse storage, requiring careful conservation treatment before full transcription was possible. The handwriting, particularly in Collins's journal, presented challenges for transcription, with certain passages remaining partially illegible despite expert examination. The published version required editorial decisions about handling unclear text, contextualizing references to individuals and places no longer commonly known, and organizing material that sometimes jumped between topics based on Collins's daily observations. This publication sparked renewed interest in traditional knowledge systems and their application to frontier survival. Several academic studies in the 1970s and 80s examined the Granite Creek case alongside other examples of knowledge transfer between indigenous, traditional, and modernizing communities in the American West. These studies helped challenge simplistic narratives of linear progress that had dominated frontier histories, revealing instead a complex interplay of knowledge systems adapting to environmental extremes. Environmental historian Richard White, whose 1983 examination of adaptive knowledge systems in frontier contexts included substantial discussion of the Collins case, observed, "What makes the Granite Creek incident particularly valuable from a historical perspective is the unusual documentation of both the initial rejection of traditional knowledge and its subsequent validation through crisis. Most similar cases of knowledge transfer between indigenous and settler communities remain undocumented or are recorded only from the perspective of those who already valued the traditional approaches, making it difficult to trace the process of changing valuation." For today's listeners, the story of Collins's fence system offers more than historical curiosity. It provides a framework for reconsidering how we value different types of knowledge, how we prepare for uncertainty, and how communities can overcome entrenched biases when faced with evidence that challenges dominant assumptions. In an era of increasing environmental unpredictability, the capacity to recognize, preserve, and adapt traditional knowledge systems may once again prove critical for community resilience. Contemporary disaster preparation experts have identified patterns similar to those displayed at Granite Creek, repeating in modern emergency contexts. Communities that maintain diverse knowledge systems, including traditional practices, alongside modern technologies, consistently demonstrate greater adaptability during extended emergencies than those relying exclusively on contemporary supply chains and technologies. The ability to access multiple approaches provides crucial flexibility when primary systems fail, allowing adaptation rather than collapse. The fence posts that once channeled desperate elk through mountain passes have long since weathered away. The smokehouse that preserved life-saving protein has returned to the earth. The hands that built them have been still for nearly a century. Yet each time we choose redundancy over efficiency, respect natural patterns instead of fighting them, or value traditional knowledge alongside innovation, we honor the quiet wisdom of Jeremiah Collins and countless others like him whose preparation for the worst ensured survival when it arrived. Modern emergency preparedness philosophy increasingly recognizes principles that Collins embodied: the value of diverse food preservation techniques, the importance of redundant systems rather than single-point dependencies, and the necessity of planning for extreme rather than average conditions. His approach anticipated by more than a century the resilience frameworks now considered cutting-edge in disaster preparation circles. The path to this wisdom was not linear progress, but rather a cycle of forgetting and remembering, dismissal and rediscovery that continues to characterize our relationship with traditional knowledge. Wheeler's final known writing about Collins appears not in his official ledgers, but in a personal letter to his son, dated 1917, discovered among family papers donated to the Montana Historical Society in 1986. In it, the elderly shopkeeper reflects, "I often think of old Collins when I hear young men mock the backward ways of their elders. I was once such a young man, certain that newer meant better in all things. The winter taught me otherwise. But Collins himself taught me something more valuable still, that true wisdom never announces itself with pride or insistence, but rather waits patiently to be recognized when most needed. Remember this, my son, and you shall never go hungry in any season of life. Wheeler's letter reveals how profoundly the experience had transformed his own understanding of knowledge and progress. Having begun as a man firmly committed to modern approaches and dismissive of traditional methods, his perspective evolved through direct experience into a more nuanced appreciation of diverse knowledge systems. His attempt to transmit this understanding to his son represents another link in the chain of knowledge preservation that Collins had initiated, a multi-generational conversation about what constitutes valuable wisdom and how it should be preserved. In the decades since these events, the landscape around Granite Creek has seen countless changes: national forest designation, recreational development, new communities established at safer elevations with modern infrastructure. Yet the fundamental patterns remain. Winter still isolates, supply chains still falter in extreme conditions, and communities still benefit from redundant preparation strategies that incorporate both innovation and traditional knowledge. Modern visitors to the Absaroka region experience a landscape that appears pristine, with few visible reminders of the mining operations that once dominated the area. The forest has reclaimed clearings, erosion has filled prospect holes, and most structural remnants have long since decomposed or been salvaged for materials. Only a trained archaeological eye can identify the subtle depressions and vegetation patterns that mark where Granite Creek Camp once stood. Nature's resilience has matched human resilience, gradually erasing physical evidence while the knowledge endures. Perhaps somewhere in the mountains of Montana, observant eyes still notice how snow accumulates against certain fence configurations, how game animals follow paths of least resistance through deep drifts, how properly prepared provisions make the difference between thriving and merely surviving when isolation stretches longer than expected. Perhaps Collins's knowledge, transmitted through practice rather than theory, continues to inform resilience strategies that mainstream narratives overlook or dismiss until necessity once again reveals their value.